If you got one of those, all right.
Working? Is it working? Oh, yeah. Should this be on?
Yep, you're good.
Okay.
Right there, is that okay?
Am I wired up? Thank you. I wasn't sure that the audiovisual was going to work, so I handed out the first handout here, which is now flashed up on the board. I was thinking that it would be too small when it's projected, but fortunately, it's a little bit larger on the screen, so it's more readable than the one that I put in front of you. First of all, the topic this evening was, strangely, it made reference to the Kentucky slave raids on Michigan in 1847. That much is correct. And it said I would talk about religious freedom. Speak up. Need more volume. Okay, without feedback. So, it mentions that.
Yeah, I said low feedback.
No, yeah. So it was to be emphasized in some respect of religious freedom. This doesn't have a darn thing to do with religious freedom. I don't know where that came from. Originally, it was titled Kentucky versus Michigan. Battle on the ground, in the courts, and in Congress. And I thought it was kind of clever. You know, people wouldn't know exactly what it's about, but they come to the meeting just to learn. Well, whoever was soliciting the speakers at the time went ahead and made their own adjustments. And then it went through, I made some corrections, and it's been through at least 4 iterations. At one time, it was about religious freedom among the slaves, and it was also, at one time, it was a talk being delivered by Jeff Murphy, and it got confused with his Flushing remonstrance. So, Jeff, you're free to come up and talk if you'd like to. You can take it over. Yeah, okay. In any event, my interest in this subject, which is about the Kentucky slave raids on Cass County, Michigan, in 1847, was prompted one day when I was going through my bathroom library and reading Michigan. I've read several histories of Michigan, but this one was produced by the Writers' Workshop, which was one of the projects of in the Depression, the Works Projects Administration, to give intelligentsia and writers an opportunity to earn a living. And so I was reading this, and all of a sudden, I've been reading, it's written in the form of, after some general introductory information, it's written in the form of tours of Michigan. And I suspect when they were writing this between 1930 and 1940, they were using a lot of old reference materials. And out of the blue, I came across this narrative description about this great battle, supposed great battle or raid, where slave owners from Kentucky were trying to recover their property, which was in Michigan. And I won't repeat it. You've all had an opportunity to read it up there. And when I saw this, I thought, well, this is a worthy subject or topic to revisit. A lot of people have heard of the slave raids, but that's about all they've heard, that there were raiders. And they've heard about the Underground Railroad, but that's all they've heard. There was an Underground Railroad. And I thought, well, it'd be worth getting into the nitty-gritty of this, maybe talking about some of the families that were subject to it, so forth, what I would otherwise call getting into the weeds. But then I realized, after doing quite a bit of reading, that this is a significant issue, because these slave raids, which I'll explain a little bit in more detail momentarily, they were among the most organized and largest and consequential of the raids which were occurring all over the country. Owners of slaves were going into free states to recover them, to bring them home. But there was something unique about this one, because as I read about slave raids, they all mentioned the Michigan raid. I want to stop right here and say that I'm grateful. We have members in this club who are professional historians, instructors, and who know these subjects in much more detail than I do. And one of them is Tom Dietz. So Tom was kind enough when I took this topic on to provide me with a bibliography, which was very helpful. And in the process of doing that, I came across a rather unique monograph, if I can call it that. Not particularly scholarly, but it's 22 pages, an original one. It was prepared in 1892 with the, I call it a remembrance, with the remembrances of the widow of Dr. Nathan Thomas, who was probably Kalamazoo's most famous conductor on the Underground Railroad. And their home, the Thomas home in Cass County, still exists. It's in Schoolcraft on Cass Street, and it's a museum. And many people here have seen that and been to it. And it just is a, and when I took the liberty of getting, on the cover of it, and I state how I came to get this monograph and get a copy of it. And I just thought it was such a unique document that I just went and had copies made for everybody here. So when we get to the end of the talk, we're going to distribute them, and you can just take them home and read them. It's not scholarly. It was prepared by a third party, and who obviously was taking notes and typing them up from Mrs. Thomas. But it's pretty unusual to have an original history like that from somebody who has information contemporaneous. Anyway, back to the slave raids. Setting the scene here, we had, speak a little bit more about this. Let me just set the scene. In Cass County, there was a community of anywhere from 300 to 400, approximately, Quaker families who were in the late 1820s had moved from Pennsylvania out to Cass County. Cass County actually has a lot of good agricultural land. They have a lot of mini prairies, sometimes known as a prairie county. People came out here because the land was cheap, $1.25 an acre, and the weather was promising, and they could grow fruit. All these things came together. So they had this vibrant Quaker community, as well as non-Quaker farmers, but all of them had one thing in common. They were ardent abolitionists. And we pop to the next. Cass County was kind of unusual. There are underground railroads all across the country, but there were two primary lines, one from Illinois and the other was from Kentucky. The one from Kentucky is what interests us. They both converged. They traveled a zigzag way across the state because they went from usually from one Quaker family to another, all on the, QT. And they ended up in Vandalia, Michigan, just outside the community. And it says there's a historical marker there which says it was the junction of two important lines of the Underground Railroad that's coming through Indiana and then also from Illinois. All came to Cass County where the Quakers were. Over time, both freed slaves and fugitive slaves, escaped slaves, found that this was a comfortable community in which to live. Many of them were bound to Canada, on their way to Canada, and they just decided to remain there. And they were accepted by the Quakers. Many of them went to work for the Quakers, made enough money to buy their own land. And they were a fairly tight-knit community. People were always aware of slave raiders. So the other part of the setting for this is the northern counties of Kentucky, which were just opposite Cincinnati. There was Bourbon County and Boone County were the primary ones. And the slaveholders there, the farmers, they were known as Southern gentlemen. They were large property owners, and they needed slaves to work their land. They were well known in the community. They were well known around the state, and they knew the politicians well, and they had a lot of influence. but they were losing slaves. They were hemorrhaging them. They were going across the Ohio River into Ohio and Indiana and moving their way up to Canada or finding hospitable communities along the way. So this was a significant loss. Losing your slaves was like losing one of your main assets. And not to be crude about it, but also when you lose, especially the females, you lose what those slaves, what the slave owners would regard as their breeding stock, because that's what their assets increased significantly when they added to the slave population. Kind of crude to think of it that way, but that's the way the slave owners thought about it. In any event, so finally they realized they had to do something about this. So they said to themselves, and they gathered together, and in 1846, maybe early 47, they sent a young man up, a spy. His name was Carpenter. He came first of all places to Kalamazoo. I don't know why. I think it may be because there were slaves in the Marshall Battle Creek area, and then there was Cass County. So Kalamazoo was right in the middle. And he met with a local attorney. What was said, we don't know. We suspect that he was engaging in this artifice that he used as he went through these communities. He was a salesman of literature and publications among the fugitives, among the abolitionists. And that was his cover anyway. So he actually went to Battle Creek and scouted out one particular family in Marshall. Crosswhite was the name, interesting name. And he was a prominent member of the community, and he was vigorously sought by his owner from Kentucky. And then he went over to the Cass County. And here you can see, just to emphasize, this is Covington right across from Cincinnati, and here is the Ohio River going all the way down here. And bear in mind that Ashland, right here, is only probably about 80 miles upriver from Covington. And the significant thing about that, I'll jump to it right now, is that it is the home of Henry Clay, probably the most powerful senator in the history of the United States, certainly the most competent. He was a great compromiser, and he could hold court for days at an end, speaking magnificently and understandably in Congress. So it was a great triumvirate, sometimes referred to, of Calhoun, Clay, and Webster. So in any event, very powerful man. They say that he was probably, he tried several times for the presidency, and for a variety of reasons he didn't make it. But even when he was not president, he's considered the most powerful man next to the president. But in any event, once they got the information from Mr. Carpenter about, he mapped out where the slaves were living. He got involved in these communities, and he was actually able to show the roads to the homes where the slaves were, or where the slave, some of them were working for the Quaker community, and they had outbuildings where they were living. He laid that all out with specificity, and he did the same for Cass County. And that's just a closer view of, you can see the Underground Railroad. It goes in everywhere. If you do any research on it, you'll just see arrows in every direction. But there was a Quaker line going from right here in Kentucky all the way up to Vandalia, Michigan. And from there, some people stayed there, but many more. Probably for everyone that stayed, there's probably 50 or 100 who moved on through the Underground Railroad, going mostly to Windsor. And a few odd bucks went up to Sault Ste. Marie, and some people passed over near Sarnia, Port Huron, all these different locations. So there were all sorts of people as part of this, providing boats to get across waterways. In any event, this is actually, remember a reference in that lead-in excerpt from the Writers Project. This is, I've kind of outlined our, this is Cass County, and right here is Calvin Center. This is Calvin Township, Calvin Center, and by and large, there was quite a close community of Quakers here, and some more over in, even some in Porter Township. And if any of you remember, and the reason I know this area fairly well is one time I described being involved in a plastic business, and that is up in Porter Township. So that got me connected to a lot of municipal officials in the county and driving around the county. This is Dowagiac up here, and this is Niles. No, this was Edwardsburg, and it is primarily an agricultural county. But when they speak of Calvin Center, that is right here. So that's the center of the county right there, where that's Cassopolis. So these slave owners came up. There were anywhere from 12 to 20 of them. Some literature says 22. Most suggested it's about 12. They came in covered wagons, and they first came up to, and then Mr. Carpenter was with them, as I understand it, to give more specific directions in case they needed them. They first went to Battle Creek under the guise of selling a new clothes washer, believe it or not. And that didn't seem right. They were kind of surveying the Crosswhite house. They wanted to grab that family. And the abolitionists sniffed them out pretty quickly. They were staying at they drove them away from the Crosswhite house, and they went back and they gathered at a tavern. And a bunch of local abolitionists who were armed, they had a posse, and then the Quakers who were just there with pitchforks, as I like to say, sharp pitchforks, but they were nonviolent, and they were mediators, and they intervened, and they basically said, we know what you're here for, you're slave hunters, get the hell out, and we will try and keep this as peaceful as possible. Quakers intervened, and then they went back down to Bristol, Indiana. Indiana is always a little bit more favorable country if you're a slave hunter, if you get my drift. And so then they came back up into Cass County here. They assembled and they came up close to Calvin Center. They parked their wagons, and they broke down into groups, maybe 2 or 3, and they went to specific homes, and they captured approximately 9 slaves. And there was a lot of tumult. A lot of people were screaming, and the Quakers quickly caught on what was happening, and people were screaming out slave raiders, and all. So messages went out to the community. In fact, the leading abolitionists in Battle Creek had sent a note to Calvin Center saying, watch out, people. There are slave hunters in the neighborhood. There are quite a few of them. And they didn't get the letter until after it. The mail, back in those days, getting from Battle Creek to Cass County was a labor. But they were in the process of gathering people up, and they were actually overwhelmed, essentially, by the Quakers and the armed abolitionists. And they were gathered around a mill a little bit north of Calvin Center, and they were basically, they were holding 9 of these slaves, fugitive slaves, excuse me. And once again, the Quakers intervened, and they were very near to bloodshed, like it'd be a shootout. The Quakers said, let's try and resolve this amicably. And they said, let's put this process before the judges. Under the fugitive slave law, especially the slave law of 1793, which I had in front of you, you have the right to take this to a court and let them decide it. Now, these slave hunters came with meticulous documentation for every slave that they intended to grab. They missed a lot, of course, but they did have 9. And they had bills of sale. They had histories of the slaves, and they were all designed to prove their claim. And so they went to, they decided, they agreed, bloodshed would bring them nothing. So they decided to put it before the court. Unfortunately, at that time, the magistrate, I'll call the commissioner, this is before statehood, the commissioner who would decide this in Cassopolis, the county seat, was not available. So they agreed to abide by the decision of the commissioner from Berrien County. And of course, the commissioner from Berrien County, his name was McIlvaine, and the Quakers knew that he was an ardent abolitionist. And they said, well, he's a good man. They got a legal opinion that he has authority to work in the county. So they, this all took about 3 days while the slaves were held and fed in a confined area. And the abolitionists were, they had been arrested, charged with kidnapping. One of them was charged with assault and battery because he got, one of the slaves fought him. And he got slapped over the head with a rifle butt and pretty seriously injured. And they actually attacked these homes in the early morning when people were sleeping. And it's kind of a famous incident. One of them was a female, and she had a child. She either ran out of the house or was out of the house when they raided it. She had a toddler. So one of the members of the, one of the slave hunters was a Baptist minister, and he captured that little child, and he was a slave owner, and he wanted the mother, so he bent the child's arm until the child screamed, and then that brought the mother back. And almost every story about the raid talks about that. So he said at the time, he said, you know, if you want the cow, you make the calf cry. So you can see the attitude. In any event, these people were taken care of. After the 3 days, they had a hearing before the commissioner, and he took the proofs, and they made, sounds like they made the case, the slave hunters. And he said he accepted the documentation that they provided. He looked it all over. He said, unfortunately, gentlemen, he said, you have made your case, but you failed to provide me with a notarized document proving that you are from Kentucky, from where you are from, is actually a slave state. And therefore, you'd have the right to own these properties. He said in the absence of that, of course, they said, you know, Judge, take judicial notice of that. Everybody knows that Kentucky is a slave state. He said, no, I have to have a notarized document showing that this is a legitimate issue, that you actually have that authority to own slaves. And he sent them packing. Now, the charges that were brought against the slave hunters were all dropped because it was moot. All the slaves came out of that, and before the night was over, they were on the road. All the slaves that had been seized, and approximately, I think between 40 and 50 were on the road to Battle Creek, wagons that had been secured for that purpose. And in fact, I think quite a few, after this raid, quite a few of the other escaped slaves, and probably even some of the freed people, were off to Battle Creek and points beyond. And because word had gone out by the Quakers, they had tentacles everywhere. They knew who had wagons, heavy wagons that they could transport these people in. And so they were gone. Well, since this is, you can just imagine having come all the way up a 3-week trip up Indiana, all the way to Cass County and to Battle Creek, and to be sent packing. They went back to Kentucky and explained what had happened to their people and how they had been humiliated and disgraced by these rascals and miscreants in Michigan who were perverting the law to get it, just to get the outcome that they wanted. And the community, not only in those counties, but the entire state was incensed, because what an insult to the people of Kentucky and the state of Kentucky. And the word spread, throughout the state of what had happened in Michigan, and this, what they considered this abuse by these miscreants and rascals. And the reaction was so negative that the legislature of the state of Kentucky authorized money for the slaveholders to file suit in the United States District Court in Detroit against approximately 12 or 13 of the Quakers. and other abolitionists, including Mr. McIlvaine. So they were all sued personally for significant damages. And there was actually a jury trial, and it was on a civil matter there, and it was a hung jury, and that only made it worse, of course. The message was out that you couldn't get justice in the northern courts under the Fugitive Slave Act. And the case was ultimately resolved, it seems, after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which I'll get to just shortly. I never got into the proceedings in Detroit, legal proceedings, but it appears that it was either a settlement or a forced settlement. Slaveholders knew, even though they knew that they weren't going to win. So they settled the case for approximately $3,000. And almost $1,000 of that went to pay court costs. And I think the other money went to pay the Michigan lawyers that had been hired by the slaveholders. So the Quakers made it very clear that under no circumstances would a penny of any court settlement and any money that any obligation of theirs would be satisfied. They did not want their resources to be connected in any way with slavery. So I don't know how the allocation of money went, but I know that they had to pay their own legal fees. And there's some ancillary sources that indicate they paid a heavy price for this. In that monograph that I'm going to distribute, Mrs. Thomas says that some of them were made so destitute or damaged by these legal proceedings that they sold their land, pulled up stake, and went to Oregon. So that's the only reference I ever found to that. Kind of one of the wonderful things about finding some kind of original documentation of what happened. So it was only in the latter part of kind of researching this that I realized that these Quakers, having to pay their own legal expenses in Detroit, suffered a significant financial loss. But that being the case, not a penny of their money was going to support the slave owners. So back, this was just fodder, losing the case in Detroit for the slaveholders. At this point, I think this is all very interesting. But the most significant part of this is that at that time, we were coming to a point where passion's really, really bubbling. And there was a sense that the conflict was inevitable. And that's when Henry Clay sat down and tried desperately, over a period of almost a year, trying to fashion a settlement. It came down with a compromise of 1850. In terms of slavery, that was really the governing issue of where slavery was going to be and who was going to get what land, because it also dealt with the land acquired through the Mexican War. So California would be a free state, Texas would be a slave state, the area between would be divided into territories where sovereignty of the people, they'll decide whether they will or will not have slavery. But it was pretty clear that there were not going to be slave states because Mexico never allowed slavery. So it was all that land that belonged to Mexico was tainted with an anti-slavery sentiment. But probably and slavery was abolished in the capital, Washington, D.C. But Clay was under tremendous pressure to make this compromise work, to come up with a revision of the Fugitive Slave Act, and one that had some meat to it. And it was quite clear, you just know, lines of communication, that he was intimately connected, knowledgeable about the Michigan raid. And in doing the compromise of 1850, this is, when I talk about maybe the arc of history, my wife and I were talking about this, and it was maybe into social context, example of the law of physics, that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. And there was certainly to this raid. And because it contributed significantly to the Second Fugitive Slave Act, which really had meat to it. But, and some of you have already read this, the last 2 pages, we talk about the Second Slave Act of 1850. This was a modification or an amendment of the 1973 Act. And it aggressively extended provisions of the original act. Law enforcement officials were required to keep people suspected of escaping enslavement and as little as claimant of ownership. Appointed for this specific purpose, and the commission fugitive, the slave fugitive from slavery, was brought for hearing, was compensated $10 if he found the individual was proven a fugitive, but only $5 if he determined that the proof to be insufficient. In addition, any person aiding a fugitive by providing food or shelter was subject to 6 months imprisonment and a $1,000 fine. The act was broadly construed in the North and prompted multiple instances of violent resistance. The Supreme Court upheld Congress's power to pass such laws in a case called Prigg versus. Northern states resisted this mightily in the form of liberty. Michigan had one in 18. Also, personal liberty laws were also passed in Michigan, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maine, Vermont, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Kansas, and Wisconsin. In Wisconsin is notorious because they invoked the compact theory of the Constitution and insisted it retained the right to nullify, which, of course, that had been years before had been a great issue with South Carolina. But Wisconsin claimed the right to nullify what they believed to be an unconstitutional rule. Oh, incidentally, there's a story of a case that went before a judge in Vermont, and they got all through with the case, and it documented it. The slave hunters documented that a specific individual belonged to them. The judge said, "Yes, you produced a bill of sale, but we cannot recognize it until you produce a bill of sale from God." And he threw the case out. That's the kind of thing. But the Second Fugitive Slave Act, it's immensely complicated. I didn't put it in front of you because it's 4 pages long. I can just see Henry Clay in his dying days. He died within 2 years of this. Sitting down there, he was in bad health anyway, writing out this document. It's huge, compromising for 5 different issues. But it was accepted with modifications which were brought by other senators. Finally, after months and months and months, it was agreed to. And it seemed almost designed, abuse, designed to address the Michigan raid. And it was almost as if Henry Clay had a summary of everything that went wrong in Michigan and all the abuses that they encountered, and wrote this law to address them. Well, in the North, the reaction was probably similar to the reaction of the Kentuckians when they found out about this case. When they saw the Second Fugitive Slave Law, it was an uproar. The whole idea that they could actually, under that act, they could actually be compelled to participate in the seizure of a slave. And that alone is noted by some historians as being a factor in precipitating civil war. It was the whole idea that the slavery issue was being pushed in the face, obligations that just kind of crazy that they never thought of and never intended. And I thought of a way to express this, and someone did it for me. I was actually in the process, as I was thinking about this issue, reading Carl Sandburg's biography of Abraham Lincoln, The Prairie Years. And just, he writes like, and He has a wonderful description of the response to the Second Fugitive Slave Act. He said, in Northern Ohio, the fugitive slave law, so correctly, so absolutely, so solidly vouched for by the federal Supreme Court as constitutional and American, had become a joke. States' attorneys, working earnestly, found it hard in a clear case of guilt to put an abolitionist in jail and keep him there. Public opinion was getting tumultuous. Thousands of good men who didn't give a hoot one way or another about slavery, it was too far off to bother them, were dead set against a law that declared them criminals if they lifted a finger or spoke in a whisper to help a runaway black man. And as plans were getting underway for the realization that year of the daily overland mail between the boundaries of Mississippi and San Francisco, Jefferson Davis, the Mississippi senator, was declaring that Congress must protect slavery in the territories crossed by the daily overland mail. Ideas and necessities snarled and showed their teeth. That's nicely put, the reaction to it. Because people who had thought that slavery was, they're not Massachusetts, Michigan, they thought it was an issue for somebody else, not affecting them in their daily lives, all of a sudden found that they could be liable for significant penalties. Actually, it's in keeping with this. Just a couple pages later, Sandberg jumps to an argument by Lincoln, because he was forever going around the states lecturing. He was the wonderful advocate for his own position, and directing his comments to some Kentucky people who were kind of baiting him. Do you think you can better yourselves on that subject by leaving us here under no obligation whatsoever to return these specimens of your movable property that come hither? When we cease to be under obligation to do anything for you, how much better off do you think you will be? Will you make war upon us and kill us all? Why, gentlemen, I think you are as gallant and as brave as men as live, that you can fight so bravely in a good cause, man for man, as my other people living, that you have shown yourself capable of this upon various occasions. But man for man, you are not better than we are, and there are not as many of you as there are of us. You will never make much of a hand at whipping us. If we were fewer in numbers than you, I think you could whip us. If we were equal, it would likely be a drawn battle. But being inferior in numbers, you will make nothing by attempting to master us. But perhaps I have dressed myself as long or longer to the Kentuckians than I ought to have done, inasmuch as I have said that whatever course you take, we intend in the end to beat you. So that's basically what it comes down to. They moved like an inimical force to conflict. It was the irresistible trend towards armed conflict, because nothing brought this out more in the South and in the North. The Second Fugitive Slave Act, written in response to, specific response to, I am convinced, to the Kentucky slave raid, which is why that slave raid is a reference, and I think I'm right, Tom, in almost all descriptions of attempted slave events where slave owners have moved into the North and sought to recoup their property. A great deal written here, but almost always incorporates the Michigan raid. And I've cut to the quick of it. I do have some other pictures just to humanize this. This is Mr. Crosswhite. He is half white, half black, and most likely half white comes from the owner. And he was quite an accomplished resident, and he was the one who lived in Marshall. And this is one of the Michigan fugitive slaves. And he went on to a life of distinction. And these are a couple of the Quakers. They have some specific names, but there's no need to get into them. This is a cartoon, a because there were no, obviously in 1847, there was nobody there to do a dagger type, but this is a sketch that's done of the slave raiders, coming. It's just as probably at sunrise and trying to grab one of the 9 fugitives that they finally collared. And, whoops. Yeah, just go back. Okay. And this is one of the shelters. This is Dr. Thomas's home in Schoolcraft. I understand that it's been refurbished and it's been moved from from its location to former location to Cass Street in Schoolcraft, and it's a museum. Let's see what else. And this was poorly resolved, but there weren't many pictures, obviously, as you can imagine. This is of a Quaker home, I believe, in the Cass County area. I don't think that there are very many, I don't know of any Quakers left. The only remnants of their community is Penn Township, Quaker Road. There's a Quaker Road where Quakers used to live, but they aren't there now. There's Penn Township, which remains, which was settled by the Quakers from Pennsylvania. There really is no evidence. You drive around this bucolic county and see active farms, and unless you did a little bit of history, you'd have no idea that this event happened 180 years ago. So had such consequences, setting up reaction to the reaction, finally culminating in 1861. Guess that's it. Thank you.
There was an important legacy to what the Hicksite, this was a branch of the Quakers called the Hicksite Quakers, and the Hicksite Quakers were much more radical than maybe the general mainstream of the Quakers. They believed not only in opposing slavery, but that you must act against slavery. So they were willing to assist with both the manumitted African Americans, Black Americans, as well as those who refugees from the South. And they helped them establish farms. They helped them buy land in Cass County. There was once a little town called Ramp Town that the Western Michigan University's archaeology department tried to see if they could find any remnants of it. They could not. But the interesting thing is if you asked about the black population of Michigan at the time that the Civil War started, you would say obviously Wayne County, Detroit area had the largest black population per county. They did. But second was Cass County. And when they began to organize black soldiers to fight in the Civil War, the 1st Michigan Colored Infantry has a large input from Cass County. So the Quakers actually helped to develop a large black community there in Cass County. And this may sound like I'm giving away a stereotype that I own, that I was me, but I remember driving some of those back roads in Cass County, and all of a sudden here comes a farmer on a tractor going through the fields, and all of a sudden I realize it's a black farmer. I grew up in a farm area in Indiana, never saw a black farmer. So, look at this, here's a black farmer. Oh, another farm that's owned by black people to this day. So the Quakers down there, they had tremendous impact on the growth of the black community here in Michigan. So just not a question for you, Dave, but just some observations. So
Well, thank you very much.
And if you're interested in the black farmers, there's an author called Anna Lisa Cox, and she has written about racial relations in covert, but she's also written extensively about early African American farmers pre-Civil War in Michigan.
along those lines, if you want to pursue this further, there are seasonal hours. There was an Underground Railroad center or society in Vandalia And they are open seasonal hours, I think mostly in the warmer months, but you can go down there, check them on the website. There's a lot of information about this raid, but also you can go there and you can visit and see, because that house was a stop on the Underground Railroad, much like the Nathan Thomas house.
Is that the Bodine House? Is that what it's called? Yeah, and it's open. Yeah, it's outside of Vandalia, several miles, I think, and then it was open at Christmas time for a couple of weeks, and then it's open in the summer. So there's an active community, but I don't have the data for this, but I suspect that with the black farmers having relatively small farms, everybody had small farms, and over time those farms were 100, 150 acres, 200 acres. They could raise a family on that, but eventually they had to sell out because the children move on. They didn't want to farm. It's a common problem now, or issue now. And so there comes farm consolidation. And I know once you have one farmer who's been able to acquire a farm through an inheritance, he can leverage that. So ultimately you have a lot of these small farmers, white or black, are bought up too. So I'm glad to hear that there still remain an active black farming community.
The small house that was dedicated to the Underground Railroad in Schoolcraft is well worth a visit.
One other thing I didn't mention, but my uncles bought a farm, one of the from the Alphadelphia Society. It was one of those from the Foyer Society he had established. Beautiful farm, about 260 acres, and it had an old farmhouse dating back to territorial days. And it caught fire a few years ago, and we always thought there was a cistern underneath. They had tenants living there, but you go in to visit with them all the time, and I was there a lot. And they always thought that there was a cistern underneath the floor in the kitchen. After the fire, there was no access to it. After the fire, they were tearing down the structure, and they found a complete room down there with a table, chairs, and it looked like some place where somebody could sleep. And they just surmised, and that house is on 34th Street, directly on the route from Kalamazoo or Schoolcraft down to Battle Creek or down to Galesburg, where there was a depot for the Underground Railroad. It was actually operated by the father of Rufus Schaffner. Rufus Schaffner was born in Galesburg. He's their most famous resident. He was the head commander of all the I think the troops at Spanish-American War. And there's a historical tablet there just off of 35th Street. And his father was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. That's Galesburg's claim to fame, yeah.
Dave, one of the things that strikes me from your talk is you don't have the Civil War maybe without the Dred Scott decision in 1857, and you don't have the Dred Scott decision without the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, and you don't get there without this slave raid. I mean, do you see that same connection, or am I connecting dots that aren't there?
No, I think that they're very much clear. I'm not going to say that this raid was the factor, but I cannot believe that given the involvement of Henry Clay in the politics of Kentucky, his proximity to these he knew the property owners. They were his voters. I mean, he knew he was with friends with some of the nastiest slave owners. He was a slave owner himself and a slave trader. That's the great anomaly of the slavery, that some of the people who were the titans of our history were also slaveholders. And he was opposed to it. He thought, like Lincoln thought, that slavery would die in the vine. And basically what they were dealing with was the expansion issue, with the expansion of slavery into the territories. It turns out that the most vocal Confederates were expansionists. That's what they wanted. They wanted Cuba and Puerto Rico, so they could be, optimal places for slaves. And they carried the day. And he basically, Clay had to, come up with this language, to get the Southerners to buy into it. And, oh, believe me, he had to twist some arms to get there. They call him the Great Compromiser for a reason. And because of the humiliation of that raid, I find it hard to believe that it wasn't a serious factor in the way that he wrote the Second Fugitive Slave Act, which I really did not think that way when I first looked into this. And then I thought, boy, bam, 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 bam. And there are other factors involved, but there were a lot of people in the North who never paid much attention to slavery, but were really aggravated, annoyed, and having been brought into the struggle.
Well, yeah. Well, I just wanted to thank you, Dave, very much for giving us this talk. And speaking for myself, you're providing a lot of little nodes of connection to my study of this period of American history, because it's pretty blank if you're from South Carolina. All this has been washed over pretty thoroughly. And to find that this is something so real here, right in this part of Michigan, that connects to the big flow of what was leading up to the Civil War, has been a real bit of insight you've provided to me. Thank you.
Tom, you're right on. It's often said that the black community in Cass County at one time outnumbered the black community, both freed and slaves and fugitive slaves, manumitted blacks. There were more in Cass County at one point than there were in Chicago or Detroit. Oh, in the Ramp. The area where they settled was called Ramp Town, and it was because the wild onions were called ramps, and they grew there. By the way, Dan, you want to help me out? I have made copies of that monograph. I want to give one. I didn't want to put it on your dinner plate or the table. It's 22 pages,